Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Sadie, for the introduction. Thank you very much to the museum here for hosting us today. Our residency is coming to a close and it's bittersweet, but I'm very excited to share my work with you today. Having one's bio read is really awkward, so let's try to humanize that whole thing a little bit. My name is Nina. I'm a professor at USC in Los Angeles at the Thornton School of Music, and I've been composing for a while, and I'm excited to share the kind of art that I make with you. But before we just say any more words, this is a sound presentation, so I'm going to play a short little piece that I composed just at the beginning of the pandemic. It's something I don't usually do. I'm a bedroom vocalist, as in I sing all the time, but secretly so nobody can hear it because it's probably better off that way. But I didn't have any performer friends around me when I was locked in my apartment, so I did some singing and playing myself. And I made a little piece called Present Perfect based on text. So it's piano performance. The piano is what's called prepared, which means you don't play the piano totally normally. There are lots of fancy ways you can prepare a piano. You can put tack into the piano. You can put screws and nails and coins between the strings and do all sorts of amazing, amazing things. It really changes the sound of the instrument into something percussive and resonant and a little bit different. I did something very simple. I just took some gaff tape, which is kind of like duct tape, but not as damaging, and put it on the middle register of the piano on the strings so as to kind of mute the string sound, but also to create this kind of percussive, bubbly, and resonant sound. So it's piano, but it sounds a little different. And then there's some processing on the voice too. And this is a piece that's based on text that I wrote while I was at Civitella Ranieri, the awkward-sounding fellowship from before. So you can see here, this is the inside of the piano. That piece of black tape just goes across near the pegs of the piano. So it's not a very terrible preparation. You can see a little bit of the file here. This is how I composed the piece after I was done improvising awkwardly. So now we'll listen to it. we've been talking a lot at the residency with the music cohort about what drives us to make art, and sort of the idea that everybody has been to school for many, many years. We study a lot of craft in composing school. So you study a lot of technique. None of us play all the instruments of the orchestra, but we have to learn about all of them and their ranges, how they work, how do you write, how do you notate, what do they sound like, what is the performance practice like, how do you combine them all together? Of course, there's the entire language of notation. And then there's the artistry of phrasing and harmony and textures and rhythm and form, all of these things that we learn. But if we just learned everything and made music like everybody else, it would sound generic. And so we've been looking at not being scared to show one's raw intentions, like what is it really that drives you? And for me, this little piece that's 3.5 minutes, I think is a very raw and true representation of what I value and what I enjoy in music. And it comes down to the idea really of resonances and bells, and the idea that we can create a lot of expansion in one simple sound and listen to the gorgeous attack and the decay that happens afterwards, and ask ourselves the questions of what happens after a musical event, what happens in our memory. And this is both a sonic game and a kind of personal game that I play with myself. And when I'm writing pieces, for me, it constructs a sonic scrapbook of the different events in my life, and it marks things that I was thinking about. So for me, this piece very much reads April 2020 for a variety of reasons. I told you some technical ones, there's some personal ones too. And so each of my pieces, I can go and visit back a moment in time. And that's a personal project, and I hope that for the audience, you can listen to just pause for a moment, listen to these pieces, and bring your own experiences and maybe reflect back on your own times. And they could be very different from everybody else in this room, and that's okay. So let's talk about what does it mean to compose. I think when people think about composing, there's the idea of someone like with an old person with a beard at a piano, and they're writing with a pencil or a pen if they're very, very, very good and committed to not revising on some music notation paper, and they do it, and then they hand it off to the musicians, and some conductor plays the music. So this is a way to compose. I say this is composing with a capital C. It's sort of the old-fashioned idea of composing. But in my practice, I do this sometimes, but it's not always. And so for me, composing is an art of creativity and play. If you look at the word to compose, we use it in many contexts. We use it not only to talk about music, we use it to compose a salad, right? And you're like, oh, I'm gonna go to the restaurant, I wanna compose, or a salad, what do you want? You wanna add chicken or whatever. But there is somebody making the decisions and the ideas of which unlike ingredients to put together and to assemble. We can compose an essay, we can compose our thoughts. So we're all composing all of the time. It just happens to be in my craft, we think about marking that with sound. So for me, it's taking everything in life and playing around with it, and then bringing these things into my artistic practice and seeing how can I combine these, be it different media, different instruments, to make things that feel interesting to me and important to me. So what can this be? This can be unlike things, it can be sounds, it can be gestures, it can be anything. So in my own practice, here you'll see a variety of things that I do. The picture on the far right, I had a premiere with the New York Philharmonic in the beginning of 2020 as part of their Project 19, in which they commissioned 19 women to write new orchestra pieces celebrating the 19th Amendment. That was a really great experience. That was definitely composing with a capital C, right? I wrote a really big score, and these awesome musicians played it, and it was incredible. The picture in the center is from a premiere at Shriver Hall in Baltimore with the American Brass Quintet, in which I was writing a piece for symphonic brass ensemble. So it's 5 brass instruments, 2 trumpets, a horn, a trombone, and a bass trombone. I grew up as a violinist. To me, that seemed really odd to be like, yes, I love brass. But it was one of the most beautiful experiences I had in my life, because these brass instruments were actually vocalists. And what I did in this project is I analyzed 15th century vocal motets, and I chopped them up into little pieces. There actually is a history of the brass quintet playing Renaissance vocal music. It's something that they really like to do. And I think they sound very beautiful and like voices in this way, and they have a flexibility of phrasing and intonation that strings, I think, can't do, because they're actually actuating these instruments with their lungs and their voice. So I studied the motets, I put them into little pieces, and then I created this kind of kaleidoscopic constellation puzzle for them to play. And I also had microphones on them and was collecting their sound with my laptop, analyzing the sound in real time, and then making some sort of generative decisions on what kind of sounds to put back into the speakers in the hall. So it's a piece about vocal music, it's a piece about spanning history, and it's also a piece about acoustic spaces and what we can do when we introduce speakers along with acoustic musicians. On the far left over here is a performance I did at Matt Smoka with the violinist Todd Reynolds. We found a bunch of found objects and we're improvising in real time, 45-minute set. We had some tree stumps. We hammered nails into the tree stumps, put rubber bands on them, started plucking them and making all these really cool instruments and sounds. And so this was an improvisation and experimental electronic set that we created. And then this project here is how I was making little percussion robots during the pandemic using Arduino so that I could have musicians play with me, even though I only had cans that I ate for my friends at the time. So for me, all of these things are part of composing, but they manifest themselves in very different ways in different projects. And so I'm going to, as I continue and play some more music, I just want to highlight some points that I think are salient within my own work. If I had to really pare down to the essences of what I'm interested in, first and foremost is the idea of collaborating with other artists and other musicians. Composing is a really lonely practice. You sit in a room, and unlike a lot of visual artists, I'm so jealous of them because they get to like be in this big studio, you get to be touching all these things with your hands, and then you can listen to podcasts. Or you can like listen to great music. If I listened to a podcast or listened to music while I was composing, I'd be very confused. It's kind of this like all-encompassing thing because you can't escape sound. And I can touch my instruments that I'm playing with while I'm composing. I play with the violin, the piano, viola, percussion, electronics, but it's not the same kind of, I think, like tactile. I just like wish I could physically sculpt something sometimes. So for me, the idea of communicating with other people through correspondence, through workshops, and eventually this thing I make, this score, or it's just like a recipe, and then I give it to the musicians who are really interpreters, and they bring their artistry to the table and bring the piece to life. And I think this is really fantastic. And then in the last 10 years, I've been really enjoying not only collaborating with musicians, but collaborating with artists in other disciplines, architects, choreographers, cinematographers, visual artists, to look at the multidimensional ways that we can create multimedia projects, and also the idea of communication. In so many of the fields of art, we use similar terminology and they mean radically different things, and I think this is fascinating to unpack. After that, for me, the idea of memory is super important. I think anybody who works in a time-based art feels this way because as soon as you experience something, it's gone. And so we have to constantly be thinking back on what happened. And I think that's super poignant and really sad and beautiful. And so the way that I like to think about this in my work is not necessarily following the standard forms that one learns, so ABA form or sonata form, but the idea that if I repeat things and don't repeat them and false repeat them and make memories and memories and memories, this idea of episodic form and phrases that cascade one into the next, we kind of get lost in a train of thought of memory and the future and never really revisiting the same thing twice. And for me, I think that's something I like to do. The next thing is timbre, which is what musicians refer to as tone color, or kind of the sonic texture, the granularity of music. So like what makes a piano sound different than a flute, sound different than a choir, sound different than bowing a cymbal or tapping your metal bowl in your kitchen, all of these different textural sounds. I really like the idea of virtuosity. It's a little bit unpopular right now, but I think virtuosity is a really fantastic thing. And something I aim to do in my projects is write pieces for my friends to show them off, and whatever that means. It might show off a sensitive little thing they do, or something really technical they do, or a grand gesture. But the idea that I want to make music that is challenging enough to push them, but never too challenging where it's just absolutely uncomfortable. Kind of that really great feeling you have when something's a little tricky, but then you really finally get it, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's awesome. I'm cool. Like that's kind of the space that I wish to gift to the musicians that I write for. As I mentioned before, I like to incorporate electronics and media. I happen to have an undergraduate degree in engineering, so this is kind of par for the course. I want that part of my life to be in my art practice too. I mentioned resonance and then sound and space. So I'm going to play you a piece next called Etched in Sand for percussion sextet. This is a piece that I wrote nearly a decade ago for a group called Six Drum in Montreal, but I finally got a really good video of it today, or yesterday. And so the video, we're still, I think the microphone is, okay. We're still in the process of doing final edits, so this is a second cut, but I'm excited to share it with you because it's a piece that I really, really love and haven't had great media to share with the public. I'm going to prime you all with something poetic that I wrote. The piece is called Etched in Sand. So let's look at the definition of to etch. To etch is to cut, carve, or engrave a text or design onto a surface. Blah, 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 blah. This process leaves a permanent design on the original medium. Okay, so when I was a kid, I would go to the shore and spend hours etching designs into the wet, hardened sand at the thresholds of beach and sea. With the sun in my back, I would revel in the glory of these beautiful and ephemeral, okay, it's cutting out. Can you guys hear me without this? Yeah, okay. Would revel in the glory of these beautiful and ephemeral pieces of art that I created using the sand as my canvas and a stray seashell as my stylus, right? So I was a kid going to the beach and being like, wow, I'm gonna make these pretty designs. And I would spend hours doing this, but I would spend hours doing this knowing that eventually the waves were gonna come at the end of the day and erase everything that I did. So I would make these crazy, crazily complex, beautiful things, and then finally watch them disappear, and then just return the next day to do it. And this is something I loved doing all of my life. I think I have a fear of permanence, and I love the idea that something is ephemeral, that I can make something and it gets washed away. And so over the course of the piece starts out, there is an etching, the etchings evolve over time, and at the end, everything washes. Percussion sextet, a lot of instruments. This has 6 keyboard instruments, 2 marimbas, 2 vibraphones, and the really interesting thing is an instrument called a sixin, which are instruments that were invented by a composer named Xenakis about, 75, 80 years ago. They are basically metal bars that are tuned in a really funky way. Here you can hear the tuning. Doesn't sound like a piano. Some of you might say that those notes are out of tune. Some of you might be like, oh, so juicy and delicious. I'm of the so juicy, delicious type of person. And I think it's really interesting to put things that are tuned this way against things that are kind of in our standard conventional tuning that most of us would be familiar with, and to look at the tension that this creates. And eventually, maybe some of the wrong notes start to sound like right notes. Okay, in this project, there was a lot of workshopping that I was doing with the musicians up in Montreal. These are wonderful musicians from Denton, Texas, from University of North Texas, who just filmed this project. But the group that it was originally written for, yeah, we spent a lot of time I was going back and forth between New York and Montreal and workshopping with them, getting the different recordings of the tunings of the instruments. And then in my own setup at home, I created kind of virtual musicians that would play whatever I was writing with the different tuning systems. And the idea of this spatial spread is super important. There's a lot of passing of the same pitch between all of the instruments and sort of a play on not only what does the pitch sound like, how is it different on each instrument, but also where is it located as a way to kind of keep interest, like a little ball bouncing around back and forth. The next work I want to share with you is called Drink Rain. I'm deciding to share this work because for those of you who visit the Atlantic Center for the Arts where we're staying, it's absolutely gorgeous there, and I feel like I'm living in a mangrove or the jungle or I'm not sure what, and the birds and the insect sounds both at night and in the morning are tremendously beautiful. I ended up spending 6 months in Puerto Rico, waking up to the sounds of the flora and fauna there a couple of years ago, and was taking a lot of field recordings at the time. And so the piece I'm going to play you right now has some of these field recordings in it. And I'm taking field recordings while I'm here at ACA, and I hope that those will manifest themselves into a piece at some point too. This is showing my little, very non-technical workstation where I wrote this piece. But one of the things I was doing is I was trying to look at both the most natural of sounds and the most synthetic of sounds at the same time, and how these might contrast. So while I was playing with field recordings that I was taking from the environment, I was also working with these little modular synthesizers here and improvising lots of material. You'll hear some voice in the piece. There's both recorded voice, which is a bunch of versions of me, and then there's also the synthetic computer voice reading text. So I wanted to play with these kind of binaries. The piece is also a collaboration with a video artist named Arluc Dubois. I was making the different stems, that is like the different layers of the piece, and I was sending him the stems, and he was going to make video for the project. And what he was doing at the time was using oscilloscopes to make the video. Does everybody know what an oscilloscope is? Okay, an oscilloscope is, you know what, I'm gonna play a little video excerpt here where he's gonna show you what they look like and explain the process.
So this is an oscilloscope. This is a analog cathode ray tube, kind of green phosphor oscilloscope. Oscilloscopes are really interesting. You know, they're basically like televisions that are wired wrong, right? So when you think about like an old school television, the signal, like like NBC News or whatever, is the intensity, and then the thing is an electron gun that's got a locked scan rate on it. So there are these magnets kind of going like, an oscilloscope is the other way around. The intensity is constant, and you send it signals for where to move the thing, where to move the ray gun. And what I've been doing is driving all the sounds from the piece into it one at a time, and coming up with different ways of taking the signals and manipulating them in a way to create different kinds of images. And they're sort of based on these things called oscillographics, these ideas that, you know, if you send kind of simple signals into an oscilloscope, you can make, you know, circles and figure eights and like little loop-de-loops and boxes and squares. So sort of taking that and kind of driving it to the extreme. So if you start with one of your tracks, your vocal track here, I can change how smooth it goes, right? So I can make it quite, you know, quite liquid.
So I'm going to pause here. So what Luke is doing is he's taking the different stems that I've made and putting them through the oscilloscope. Then he has, you can see a little GoPro hooked up to the oscilloscope, and then he's taking videos of these, and then he's digitally manipulating them later to create this sort of tapestry of video effects that you'll see in the piece. And so we were both working from analog and digital and converting it into like kind of the wrong way, something that like usually I work we like both usually make digital art, and in this case we were taking digitized signals and then making them acoustic and then digitizing them again later on, which is kind of an interesting process. He was also using a bunch of synthesizers, so he was washing the signals that I was sending through modular synthesizers to also manipulate the shapes in different ways. And so now we will watch the video, which you will see. It's just going to be sound, and then you're going to see the video graphics. We have a few minutes left, so I was wondering if anybody had any questions. It depends on the project. This last piece I wrote in about 5 days. But I was doing basically just that, and there was a lot of collection of sounds beforehand. And then I put it down for a few days, and I did some editing, and then production of the sounds, and then it was the correspondence with the stems and the video artist, and making some adjustments from there. But I think that project, start to finish, was about 2 weeks. And there are times, I have times that are very speedy like that, but then there are other times where pieces take months. So the percussion sextet that you saw just before this, that was probably in total 4 or 5 months of work, including workshops. If we don't have any more questions, I'll play another project that I'm really proud of that took about 3 years, but a total number of composing sessions, I would say, was probably like a month. But spread over time. Sometimes, it's not just the labor that you put, the physical labor that you're putting into things, it's the time in between, the reflection, the revision, the change of perspective. So it definitely varies a lot. I'm finishing a violin concerto right now, and I name my files every time I re-enter a project, and today I'm on version 83. So it's like the 83rd time I've sat down to work with the violin concerto. Yes, I'm a professor, so that's something we talk a lot about, especially for people first entering music school. I think the way that we think of the answer to this question varies. The response today would be different than it was 30 years ago, would be different than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. One could say that music is the organization of sound. For me, I find something to be music when I sculpt it together in a particular way. But I also participate in the sonic arts. I didn't show you those projects today, but I do sound artwork as well. And I do work that is generative and long scale and takes a long time. And for me, these are performative adventures into really exploring the beauty of sound. And if we put a frame around it, so if I say like, oh, I'm gonna walk through an installation and I'm gonna listen to something a particular way, I have created my own musical happening because there's a beginning and an ending, and I've put a frame on it. Just like, we could say like every landscape is a photograph, but you're as a photographer putting the lens on it and saying that that's my photo. Whereas sound is happening all of the time. It's how do we pay attention to it and when? Something curious I think about a lot is how sound is happening all the time, and we can't really make it go away. Like if I don't want to see anything, I can close my eyes. If I don't want to look at you, and especially with the spotlight here, I can't see you anymore. But if you were to talk, I can still hear you. I can cover my ears, I can put my earplugs in, I can put my sound cancellation headphones, but I'll still hear a little bit of you. It takes a lot more to escape sound. But then just like with anything in our perspective, I can focus in on what you're saying, or I can focus on the hum of the air conditioner over there, or the fan that's occurring, or the lights. Or if I play something, I can constantly change my focus. And my focus is going to change in a different way than your focus is going to change. And that's why we could be in the same environment, and you and I could compose very different pieces or very different sonic envelopes around that. It's kind of a cop-out answer, but that's how I think about it. Well, do you know anybody who can help me out? It's interesting, the idea of commercial versus non-commercial music. And then we have in this non-commercial art space that I live in, there's also like commercial recordings and non-commercial recordings. Like, is it available on Spotify or is it not available on Spotify or Amazon or Apple or whatever, big money, terrible thing to artists you want to sign up for. So I decided in my practice that I want to live in the art space. So I wrote like advertising jingles for a little while in grad school. And so what would happen is they would send me a recording of something that they didn't want to pay the royalties for and ask me to make something that was like close, but not close enough to get in trouble. And that was fun. It made money. And it was a way to exercise my craft, but I felt like I had no creative agency over it. And so I think that, yeah, if somebody wanted to take this repertoire and put it in the movies or on a Geico ad, like, I guess, sure, why not? But I don't think I'm interested in making work specifically for that. Having said that, I just finished a short film. I've done some film work, mostly with independent artists, experimental shorts, and I just finished another film project with a composer who's a filmmaker in Colombia named Santiago Ferrero that's going to be released in the fall of this year. And I'm really excited about that. And I had a lot of fun scoring for it, but it's also like the sound is a character in the movie. It's not just like to make you feel certain ways. But if you have any connections, please let me know. That's a great question, and I think something that so many people, like, we hit our heads against the wall about this. And I think for a long time, I would get stuck. I would be writing and I would get stuck and I wouldn't know what to do. So I have all these tricks that I do now to make sure I never get stuck. And part of that is this idea of play in my composing process. So when I'm starting a project, usually I have some kind of poetic or conceptual project specifications. I really like the fact that I can have an instrumentation or know the media, the restrictions, any kind of restrictions I can give myself really help, because it's like easier to be creative when you have a small box to work in. And so often I'll build that own small box for myself if that doesn't already exist, so that I can have some sort of like rules that I can push against. Of course, I can always break my own rules because I'm the boss, but I think that these kind of creative constraints really help. And then after that, it's really, what I do is an improvisatory practice where I call them like little seedlings. So I make somewhere between 3 and like 10 little musical seedlings, and I plant them. Some of them are sketches on paper. Some of them are already like fully orchestrated, notated stuff. Some of them are audio recordings. Some of them are synthesized stuff. Some of them are these like algorithmic things that I make in this computer programming language called Max that generates things, whatever. And even if I'm writing a string quartet, maybe I'm doing some of the computer stuff. It's not exclusive to the medium. And so I plant these little seedlings, and then every day I ask myself, okay, like, let's add a little bit more to them, and then you see which ones grow. Some of them grow, some of them don't, and the ones that don't, you let them die off. They go somewhere else. And eventually I find that they start to intertwine and grow into one another. I've also found it very helpful to not be like, oh, I have some music, let me write the music that happens after this, but rather to always write the music that comes before. I think it's much easier to walk somewhere than to know where to walk once you're somewhere. Otherwise, you're just kind of like meandering. Whereas if you have an intended place to go, you can figure out a route there. So for me, the seedlings that I plant often end up in different parts of the piece, but the very first music I write is usually at the very end, and everything is kind of the breath, the upbeat, the thing that's going towards that. It also, I find this process allows me to create forms. Like I mentioned, I like this idea of episodic form or cascading into something. So I can take something and then be like, oh, it's actually like plant B is related to plant F in these ways. So how about I take a little bit of B and a little bit of F, and I put that here and here too, and then I can plant this here, and I can, clip that flower from over there and add this to this leaf, and it becomes this really intertwined network. So even if the materials are very different, because I'm the person making them all, they're inherently related somehow, and I find this to be a fun way to never get stuck. And sometimes I have gaps in my projects, like the thing I'm working on right now, I have 4 or 5 gaps, but I'm like, I'm not gonna deal with those gaps right now. I'm gonna go to another section and work on that, and maybe what I do there will inform what happens in the gaps later on. I have never heard a piece in its totality and then written it down.
Okay.
Never, ever, ever.
Phrases?
But I have these, like, I have ideas and sounds and things that I like, or like little phrases, and these are like the little seedlings. So I plant them in places, and then I have to grow them in a very, I think it's organic process, because when I was a student, I would like make very formal maps and be like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and it's going to go here, and it's going to go here, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do, and I had like all these decisions and these graphs, because you needed to like prove that you were doing something the right way. And I very quickly realized that the music felt very stifled if I did it this way, and that I needed to have these landmarks and ideas, but to be okay with saying, once the project gets going, I let it guide itself, and I'm the shepherd and the follower at the same time. And I want the work to go where it intends to go. And sometimes I have radical surprises ahead of me, and I haven't realized that something is there. So yes, I have very clear intentions, I think, at the beginning of a project, but it will never end up being that way.
Is that partly extrinsic as you hear it back to yourself?
Oh yeah, I think that's part of it. I spend a lot of time listening, and I have different modes of doing it. Like I'll create mock-ups on the computer. There's a thing called playback if you're writing notated music. So I'll listen to the tempo and the form of something. I'll perform in different ways the music that I'm writing. I'll send stuff to musicians to make these like very crazy mock-ups. If I want to make something and I don't know how to do it, I'll use my voice and I'll record it, and then I'll try to transcribe whatever it is later. And I'm thinking a lot about pacing and how things work. So there's a lot of adjusting all the time there. And the other thing I really like to do is I like to go on walks. And while I'm trying to work out an idea, I will walk in some relationship to a tempo or a pacing in the piece. That way I can physically embody myself, the counterpoint of what's occurring. So like I walk in a particular frame of time to see like what happens, like how long does this have to take, and then do I have to take a step backwards? Do I have to change my tempo? Do I quicken here? How does it feel in my body? When I was like taught violin, I was supposed to be like so rigid and not move. Like my first teacher really damaged me in this way, and my second teacher was all about trying to get that rigidity out of my body and allowing myself to express and to feel and to breathe with my appendages and my digits, and my chest and my neck and everything. And so yeah, I really think that the body can inform us about a lot. Boop. Okay. This is what I'm going to play you. Yeah. I think I'm going to show you this. This is a piece called Heartthrob. You're going to be like, why did I stay for this? For snare drum and electronics. The doors are locked now. You can't leave. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this project. So this project is it was thought up by this amazing percussionist named Mike Compitello. He's currently a professor at Arizona State University running the percussion program over there. I met him from back when he was in New York. He's an absolutely phenomenal soloist, plays in the top chamber music groups in the country, and has a virtuosity that's like unrealistic for detail, and also the ability to choose colors and everything to just sound absolutely gorgeous. And he is very, very well known for his detailed work with marimbas, and how he can get all these colors out of marimbas. And so one day he called me on the phone and was like, oh yeah, like we should work on a project together. And I was like, yes, absolutely. And I'm imagining all this keyboard percussion, all this great stuff. And he's like, yeah, so I'm gonna get at this consortium of composers together, and it's gonna be so great. And I was like, yeah, sign me up. And he's like, yeah, and it's gonna be for solo snare drum. And I was like, oh, just kidding, not interested. And he was like, no, like I think it'll be really great. I want to expand the repertoire for what this instrument means. And I thought, like, what relationship do I have with this drum that is militaristic? You strike it, you beat it. It just seemed like the antithesis of everything that I'm interested in musically. So he said, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. And so I said, okay, like, can it at least be like snare drum and electronics? And he said, no, I want to just take one drum and be able to tour it around super easy, not a whole, like, you know, I feel so bad for percussionists. They have to carry all of this gear around all the time. It's terrible. So what he did to sort of soften the idea, me and these 3 other composers, he showed up at our different houses. He was house sitting for me. And when I came back, there was a snare drum in my apartment with these mallets and like a little note that said, play me. And like, as a musician, you can't just like leave an instrument in somebody's apartment and like, you know, you can't help it. So at first I side-eyed the thing. I was really pissed off. I was like, wow, what is this doing? And then I started, you know, touching it and petting it. And next thing I was like on YouTube learning paradiddles, and my neighbors wanted to kill me in New York City, you could imagine. And so one of the things that I was experimenting with is I got these things called transducers. And if any of you are going to come to the Open Studios on Thursday, I think that you will see some of these in action. One of our composers here, James, is working on a project with transducers. So what's a transducer? A transducer is equivalent to a speaker, but it you actuate not like the speaker cones vibrate back and forth, and then they change the air pressure, and then that's what like gives us the sound waves into our eardrums, and we hear the sound. What the transducers do is they wave up and down the same way that a speaker cone does, but you can attach them to different surfaces. So I could amplify this wall or the mirror or the glass, or you can put it on your head and start to hear your head. It's really, so you can create a speaker out of everything. And when you create a speaker out of anything, that material's inherent acoustic characteristics, is it absorptive, is it reflective, what frequencies does it promote, what frequencies does it attenuate, it's gonna act like a filter for that sound. So I thought, okay, he said no electronics because he didn't want to have to deal with a whole bunch of gear and speakers, but what if I turn the drum itself into the speaker source by putting a transducer on the bottom of it? The drum has 2 heads, so it inherently becomes a speaker. This speaker will then resonate the instrument, and Mike, as the percussionist, is not only responsible for playing the instrument, but he's also the person who's going to filter out the sounds that the speaker is playing. So in this way, the drummer doesn't play the drum, but the drum plays the drummer. And I thought that was a way to sort of turn the narrative around from this aggressor who might be like beating the drum and think about what happens if we have to filter sound and become tactile and more gentle and touch the instrument in different ways. And so what I ended up doing was I would feed a bunch of different sine tones. So these are very basic oscillatory frequencies into the drum, making these different harmonies. The drum itself would then resonate in a particular way. Mike is also, I have like all this, it's a very virtuosic piece, and I'm looking at other ways of creating pitches. So instead of just hitting the drum with the sticks, he's also playing a lot on the rim of the drum. And if you took a pencil or a pen and you started tapping it like this, you'll hear like, it filters the sound the same way. And then he uses his hands to filter the sound of the drum, and it creates this kind of duo dialogue. The computer is listening, so it has a transducer. There's also a little contact microphone, so I have a little computer program that this whole system goes through, and it listens to what Mike is doing and responds, and then he performs with it. So we can, this is kind of a map of what that looks like. This is the computer program thing for those of you who care, and now we will, this is the score, right? This is like the crazy notation system. And here I'm really concerned not only with the notes that he's playing, but where is he playing on the drum? So it's like all of these different techniques, because where you play on the drum really changes the sound. So we had to come up with a notation practice that could reflect all of the choreography of what he has to do. And then he made this beautiful album called Unsnare Drum. I produced the album. It also has works by composers Tonya Ko, Han Lash, and Amy Beth Kirsten. It's phenomenal. Nobody wants to listen to a solo snare drum album, but we put 13 mics on the drum, and each and every piece has very, very different sonic characteristics. We played so much with the engineer and coming up with how to make this beautiful, and it's like really an outstanding piece of work. So like listen to this project. And then Mike made these beautiful music videos to go along with. will stop there for now, for time's sake, but you can listen to the rest of it. The video's available on YouTube. Thank you very much for,
Thank you so much.